Why is our immunity under attack? There's a massive increase in both the number of children and adults with allergic-like reactions to foods and chemicals, and the severity of these reactions, as well as autoimmune disease, where the immune system, which should be our friend, starts attacking not only foods and chemicals, but our own body. Many people are cruising out of the COVID infection or vaccination highly compromised with such autoimmune issues. What is going on? In this podcast, I interview Antony Haynes, author of the award-winning Food Intolerance Bible, a pioneer in functional medicine and leading expert in autoimmune disease with 30 years clinical experience. Antony, welcome to my podcast.
Thank you, Patrick. A pleasure to be here.
Now, one of the most common approaches you recommend to your clients involve not just avoiding the substances that are found to be intolerant, but supporting mucosal immunity and integrity in order to improve oral tolerance. It reminds me a little bit of how we think about cancer. You know, the idea is you just remove it and there lies the problem, but you've got to look at what is it that's underneath that is allowing a cell, in that case, to become cancerous. So I'm delighted to have you because you are at the cutting edge of science and successful resolution of immune system breakdowns. And I want to learn from you how to turn my immune system into my friend, not my enemy.
Exactly. Yeah, well, thank you, Patrick. I think there is a very good parallel there. And you're right, underneath, you use the word underneath, and it certainly is, it's the river that runs through us. It's our gut lining where, as you may well know, 70, possibly 80% of immune reactivities occur within that environment. That's vital to support. In fact, one amazing statistic is the number of immune reactions that occur in the gut in one day, if an adult or a child eats 3 meals a day, is estimated to be greater than the immune system reactions that occur in the whole body for the whole of one's life, should one live to 80 or over. So there's an awful lot of immune activity going on in the gut, and that's probably where we'll start. And you're absolutely right. I do look absolutely to support mucosal immune system activity and gut lining integrity with any client. In fact, I was asked the question just last week, and I would estimate that I would say about 50% of my clients, looking back with an unaudited view, that at least 50% of my clients have some support for the gut lining.
Now, in the past couple of years, I'm encountering more and more people who have developed autoimmune diseases. Again, some after COVID infection, some after vaccination, and more parents reporting extreme allergic-like sensitivities in their children. Can you start by explaining what an autoimmune disease is and whether allergies are more common these days, especially in children, and whether autoimmune diseases are on the increase?
Yeah, definitely. So an autoimmune condition is one in which the immune system develops antibodies to one's own tissues. So effectively, it's you're attacking self. So it's a failure to recognize yourself as friend and attack it as if it were a foe. And there are an ever-increasing number of potential blood tests to look at the various different tissues to which one might have antibodies. So absolutely, autoimmune disease has become a phenomenon of the last 40 or 50 years, by far and away increasing exponentially. I mean, hundreds and thousands of percentages compared to 50 years ago, when it was much less significant. And there are various theories about that, including, the hygiene theory, antibiotics and vaccinations as well. But effectively, the immune system is making a mistake, or at least we think it's making a mistake, by attacking our cells, different tissues. And I've learned from fantastic professors exactly why that happens. And I'll certainly share more about that if I can. In fact, what was fascinating is that I learned it's not so much that the immune system is attacking our own cells. What's interesting is that it attacks our own cells if they are corrupted by something else. And by that, I mean toxins and or viruses in particular.
Now, before we dive into that, which really is the set of circumstances that create this kind of reaction, what are the common autoimmune diseases? Not everybody will understand what those diseases are.
Yes, I think there's a list, official list of about 80, and there's a sort of unofficial list of going up to 200. Rheumatoid arthritis, psoriasis, Crohn's disease, and ulcerative colitis. And then you have lupus, which is SLE, lupus. Then there's scleroderma. There is multiple sclerosis is a very famous one, neuromyelitis optica. So those are common ones. So arthritic.
And type 1 diabetes.
And type 1, thank you. Yes, type 1 diabetes, which is actually a unique one on its own, is that it's probably the most well documented and one of the only autoimmune conditions in which there are more boys than girls.
And the strange thing, if you just take that type 1 diabetes, is it used to be called child onset diabetes, and
Yes.
type 2 is adult onset diabetes. Now the youngest age of adult onset diabetes type 2 is 3.
Yes, yes.
And there are so many adults who go from type 2 diabetes into type 1. In the same way, there are people who have osteoarthritis, not autoimmune or not conceived of in that way, and then they tip into autoimmune rheumatoid arthritis. Yeah.
Yes, indeed, yes.
So what are the set of circumstances that create the development of either an autoimmune disease later in life or in children, or allergies? Because we think of allergies always as a reaction to a food, but is it such a clear line that that's not autoimmune? What's the...
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's really interesting to marry the two together, or actually look at the two together as parallels, because it's actually the same setting sets up for allergies, sets up for autoimmunity. I know you appreciate that, but actually it may not be something that we're all aware of. What set the scenes for allergy is there are a number of things, effectively. Overconsumption in no particular order. The overconsumption of a specific food, and let's choose wheat or gluten as an example. So overconsumption of a food or foods to which there's a high chance of having a reactivity. So it's overconsumption of those, what I would refer to as the usual suspect foods, which is wheat, gluten, dairy, eggs, and soy, perhaps, those perhaps being the biggest ones of all. But not everybody who consumes lots of wheat has a food sensitivity or allergy, and we'll clarify what the difference is if you wish. Effectively, we need to have a robust mucosal immune system, and I referred to the 70 or 80% of all the immune system reactions occurring in the gut, and the massive number that occur in the gut. And we've got a very, very sophisticated system within our guts where we first meet foods, and ideally we'd actually meet that food and tag it as, okay, you're tagged, you're okay, we're not going to have an inflammatory reaction to you. And that tagging occurs through something called secretory IgA, which is the number one allergy prevention molecule in the human body, secretory IgA. And it varies tremendously in its output depending on the state of our well-being and stress and exercise and so on. So low.
Can you measure it?
You can, yes, you can measure it. It can be measured in stool, the stool testing, which is a little bit more inconvenient, and it's probably less accurate than a saliva test. So it's actually very straightforward in terms of doing it from home. And there are a number of different labs, functional laboratories, which offer a secretory IgA as a spit test. So yes, you can measure it. And I found consistently that levels are low. In fact, stool levels are not so useful, but saliva testing, I've seen over 3,000 of these secretory IgA tests alongside measurement of cortisol, for example, cortisol being the major adrenal sort of stress or anti-stress hormone. And there's a strong connection between secretory IgA and cortisol and stress levels. So I've seen 3,000. It's the most frequent test that I've conducted in my clinical career so far. And it's a very useful indicator.
So just to recap, the secretory IgA is therefore a bit like the bouncer at the nightclub that's going to let you in or not. And if if you don't have secretory IgA, then you're no longer tagged as a friend, and therefore the immune system can go haywire.
Yes, exactly. If you don't have the stamp on, then actually there's a greater ruckus when you get to the club, as it were, when you got into the body.
Why would some kids, let's say, or babies or infants, have low secretory IgA?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there are more and more of them. From research that I've read, about 5% of the population have a genetic inborn levels of low secretory IgA. So it's quite rare for that to happen. That's estimated to be about 5%. So that could be an explanation. It's a genetic phenomenon, which may have occurred over the last few generations, as opposed to longer than that. Otherwise, the factors that contribute to it could well be the food that the mother's eaten during pregnancy, the state of mind that the mother was in during pregnancy, possible medications that were used at birth is a possibility, including antibiotics during pregnancy, could have adversely affected the gut microbiome, the bacteria, the now famous, most people are aware of the gut microbiome being such a vital process. So vaginal birth babies are likely to have a stronger innate immune system, and C-section babies need to be vaginally swabbed immediately after birth to maintain that or to provide that fundamental platform of healthy gut microbiome. So there's many things that can upset that. So stress, microbiome imbalances, and overconsumption of foods to which there may be a high likelihood of reactivity.
And if someone has a low secretory IgA, what can you actually do about it?
Yes, you can. There are two probiotic substances in particular that have been hugely studied, and we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of papers published on the subject. There's one is a probiotic yeast, which on the face of it might sound as if, oh, that's not the right thing to take, but it's called Saccharomyces boulardii, which refers in Latin, basically it's the yeast of Boulard. And Dr. Henri Boulard was he's Frenchman, he was traveling in Malaysia, and he discovered this on a lychee in Malaysia, Saccharomyces boulardii, in the same way that perhaps penicillin was discovered by Louis Pasteur. It was sort of by chance. And Saccharomyces boulardii elicits and helps to support secretory IgA more than any other probiotic substance known. So in that sense, yes, I've used and recommended S. boulardii thousands of times and still do. And then the probiotic bacteria, which is also the most studied bacteria strain in the world, is Lactobacillus GG, named after two professors from Tufts University. And that also helps to support secretory IgA. In fact, one could consider taking both. So you're actually supporting the natural output of secretory IgA, which I think is the only non-inflammatory immune reaction in the body. So you want to reduce inflammation, and that's what secretory IgA does. So taking those two probiotics, or one of them, can certainly have a tremendous impact. There's also adequate levels of vitamin A, vitamins D, and zinc and vitamin C, and it's very likely for at least one of those to be insufficient in anyone we might need, let alone a child or an infant.
Now, I read that glutamine, which of course is a direct fuel for those mucosal cells, also helps to promote secretory IgA. Is that the case?
Yes, it is. Yes, glutamine. I remember being actually, I think in your company in the 90s, when the glutamine sort of hit the headlines as sort of all around Mr. Muscle of amino acids, but also it does support the gut lining. It has a degree of support for secretory IgA, but in terms of the rate, as far as I can note from the research, it's if Saccharomyces boulardii achieves a 10 score for supporting secretory IgA, I believe that glutamine is a sort of 2 or 3, if that helps.
Now, if you did, I mean, for example, I'm thinking of an infant here, and maybe you haven't been able to test SIGA. Would there be any harm in putting in a few drops of vitamin A and D and some glutamine powder, which dissolves, and some Saccharomyces boulardii and some Lactobacillus GG, just anyway?
That occurs to me is utmost the precautionary principle. It's super, the word safe shouldn't even come to the conversation, because that suggests there's something unsafe. So it's super nourishing. And I would say it's an entirely logical, sensible thing to be doing. Compared to any other method. It's ultimately supporting the terrain to allow the body's wisdom, that little body's wisdom, to do what it will, which is to support its own system. So absolutely. Now, the levels of vitamin A and D, because they're fat soluble, one needs to ensure that the levels are appropriate for a small one, for sure. But effectively, yes, absolutely. In fact, vitamin A, it just interesting me, because vitamin D has been something that we're very aware of. Many individuals may have a higher level of vitamin D than vitamin A. In some instances, vitamin D can block vitamin A because it's had the same receptor, and that may occur in the gut. So it may be appropriate to actually consider the use of vitamin A first, and then wait a month and then add on vitamin D, just as a more technical perspective.
Yeah, vitamin A is the subject of a massive myth, and I'll tell you how it breaks down. Basically, Roche knew that vitamin A was fantastic for the skin, but they couldn't patent it, so they created isotretinoin, basically trans-retinoic acid, vitamin A, but messed up and patentable.
Yes.
And then some babies were born with birth defects, and this was attributed to the drug, not vitamin A, but to the drug.
Yes.
And in fact, I've never ever heard of a case of birth defect as a consequence of supplemental vitamin A.
No, and this is the conversation we've had with practitioners who called in and support practitioners, that they're saying, oh, will there be a teratogenic effect from the vitamin A? And all the supplement companies, they're now putting mixed carotenoids in their supplements. But you and I may well know also that about 45% of the European, Northwest European population at any rate, don't convert the carotenoids to vitamin A. So it's actually the vast majority of mothers-to-be would actually end up being insufficient in vitamin A and not being helped by the carotenoids in their prenatal supplements. So it's sort of been the market reaction to that. I agree. It is one of the biggest myths, I believe,
and so much so that on supplement labels they actually have to say, do not take vitamin A in pregnancy and breastfeeding. Yes. Yeah. And I always use evolution as my backup. And of course, we know that vitamin A is incredibly rich in organs, the brain, the liver, the kidneys, and eyes.
Yes.
So all animals go straight for the organs, and no doubt our human ancestors, when hunting or fishing, would also, eat the organs first, and that's where you get the vitamin A. So why would a naturally occurring substance that we've evolved with over millions of years be teratogenic? The logic makes sense.
I'm completely in agreement with you. I acknowledge that. I've heard this story before, and yes, and the likelihood of having, apparently a woman who ate a polar bear's liver over a period of time, she must have been an Inuit, developed some degree of vitamin A, but of course it wasn't to do with pregnancy and teratogenesis. But the incidence of this is unbelievably rare, and as you say, it may well only be associated with the drug form.
And probably was the polar bear who ate the woman's liver, but we don't see a lot of teratogenic polar bear pups.
Yeah.
Now, how can someone have a mild reaction to a substance one day and an extreme reaction another day?
First of all, it may be that I don't know the answer to this, but I have, having seen about going on 20,000 clients, I have heard this very thing, and it's sort of scratch my head. So I guess I start with I don't really know, but the factors that could contribute to it could be the amount of the allergen in the body. But let's just say the person ate the same amount of the substance one day and the next day. I think it could depend certainly on the overall busyness of the immune system, i.e. the allocation of resources. So there's a histamine reaction. These antibodies are reacting to this over there, that over there. But if they aren't reacting to they aren't having any other battles, they're not having hand-to-hand combat over there, there may be a greater ability to mount a bigger immune response in the absence of other foods, which are causing some lower degree of reactivity, which is not necessarily manifesting in symptoms. So that's one aspect, i.e. the busyness of the immune system itself. It could also depend on the level of the time of day, because the time of day also has a big impact on the output of cortisol. Cortisol should be high in the morning and low at night. So again, I'd be looking at, was it identical meal, identical time of day, and therefore what are the reasons other than that? Certainly the gut microbiota can change within 24 hours depending on our food intake, so that could play a role. And it also potentially there could be an issue with other factors, which we might come on to do with histamine, is that there are a number of things that influence the level of histamine within the gut, and or factors that might inhibit the enzyme that breaks it down. And there could be that indirect effect going on. So therefore, there's a greater level of histamine to which to respond to that food on that particular day.
Now, do children outgrow allergies? And if so, why? And for those who don't, why not? What's going on here?
Yeah, and it's a good question. Again, I'll start with, I'm not sure if I know, and I've certainly studied this area, but many children do, in fact, they do outgrow some of the most common food allergies to milk, to eggs, to soy, wheat, nuts, and fish. Interestingly, these same immunological researchers identified that environmental allergies to pollen and mold and dust, things that we breathe in, are usually not outgrown. So there's a different kind of response to things that we inhale compared to those which we eat. Now, whether or not a child outgrows an allergy depends what he or she is allergic to and when the allergy develops. So when did that occur in life, and how severe is it? The more severe it is, the less likely it is to be outgrown. I've got a comment about that, but each child's individual mucosal immune system needs to be optimally supported, as well as the child being optimally nourished. So we need to nourish the whole individual and the specific terrain in the gut. And there again, we come back to key nutrients. Although there may be 50 essential nutrients, but there are key ones for this aspect of health: vitamin D, vitamin A, zinc, vitamin C, and glutamine, which is a non-essential amino acid, may also certainly play a role. And all of those could actually then have a major impact on whether the child can outgrow their allergy. Now, the studies that I've been reading over the years never look at those variables. They just look at a sort of a retrospective epidemiological incidence of whether the child has recovered or not without looking at those variable factors. But it seems that the kids with a milk or egg or soy allergies are more likely to outgrow them and at a younger age than kids with other allergies. And the younger your child is when the allergy is developed, the more likely it is that it will be outgrown. However, unfortunately, most children who experience those severe reactions, they say they're likely to never outgrow it. But I would say my response to that is, well, these children specifically need the help of nutritional therapists familiar with supporting mucosal immunity.
Now, when I wrote Optimum Nutrition for Your Child, the pediatric advice at the time was to delay the introduction of high-risk food allergens such as wheat, milk, soya. Now, quite a few studies seem to suggest the opposite: early exposure to potential allergens to reduce later risk of developing allergies. There's also quite a few studies about desensitization, in introducing kids who are allergic to very, very tiny quantities. So what's your take on these two schools of thought?
Yeah, and I think I was swept along with the first one, and dare I say it, if I'd have had children at that time, which I think I did actually 21 and 16 years ago, I said avoid those foods. So I held the belief, avoid, delay exposure to the last possible moment. However, having been appreciative of these new studies, I have to say, and understanding the immune system, or at least my understanding of the immune system, not that I will ever understand it fully, I'm sure, I would say that controlled small exposure to the high risk foods in order to minimize the risk of developing sensitivity later is the best way to go. And so what it means is that effectively nothing really changes, is that our children would be avoiding gluten, dairy, maybe eggs still a bit later, and soy. They'd be avoiding them, but only on certain occasions. Let's say once a month, there will be a small controlled intake. So it's largely following a diet which is excluding these foods, which have other negatives, because they also may be heavily sprayed, for example, or maybe the major source of glyphosate in the diet, and so on, i.e. the gluten grains. I would say that intermittent controlled exposure to small amounts would be the best way to go.
Now, I'm glad you mentioned that about the glyphosates, but not just that, because many years ago, I met a very charming man called Bob Quinn, who always walked around with his cowboy hat with a piece of kamut Khorasan, which is an ancient and very genetically simple wheat sticking out of it. And he told me how wonderful this was. He had 8,000 acres growing organic wheat, never hybridized, the exact grain that we were eating probably 20,000 years ago. But that was, well over a decade ago. And now there are 27 studies, very good studies, crossover studies, where people have put on this ancient Khorasan wheat or regular normal wheat for 6 weeks each, with a gap in between, not knowing which they're on. IBS, cardiovascular disease, diabetes. A recent one I think was on non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. But what's fascinating is that in every single one, when they measure the actual markers of inflammation, you're getting somewhere in the region of a 30% reduction in inflammation. In other words, the body is treating this ancient wheat, which is very full of gluten, as a friend, while they're treating the modern wheat as an enemy. And we always point the finger at gluten, but here is a gluten-containing grain. And I have the idea that actually what's happened is some of these foods like soya and dairy products and wheat are phenomenally different to how they originally were, because they're very commercial. So making hybridizations that have more gluten in the case of wheat, or soya, for example, the early soya milks, were terribly flatulent producing, but now there are strains of soya beans which don't have the inhibitors of digestion.
So alpha-galactosidase, yes.
Exactly. They're very messed up foods. Same is true with yeast. I mean, yeast is now basically used to alter the way that, foods taste and their texture and everything else. So that's just my thought. It may not be that soya is a terrible food or that milk is a terrible food or whatever, but we've messed around with the molecules a lot.
I have to say, as far as I understand, that's exactly the way it is. And when you mess around with the molecules, you change the amino acid sequences. And the amino acid sequences, this is one story I've heard from, I think it was Alessio Fasano, who has been pioneering look at the leaky gut story, is that the amino acid sequences match those of certain bacteria which we've evolved to, that are negative bacteria, that are disease-causing bacteria. So our immune system is much more likely to react to them, because those amino acid sequences resemble the bacteria. So it's interesting. So cross-reactivity. So the hybridization has, unwittingly or not, actually led to the foods being more recognizable as bad by the immune system and having action. I think to add on to that, I think you add on to that the chemicals that have been sprayed onto them. That's going to make that worse. And then you add on to the fact that actually people may be consuming these foods 3 times a day and having way more than we used to have. I think all of that lends to the reason why they're the usual suspects.
And when I was saying earlier on that we've got, autoimmune diseases and then we have allergies, we know about this phenomenon of cross-reactivity. In other words, the body starts to seemingly react to a food protein, but starts to attack a body protein.
Yes.
So in a sense, that line between autoimmune and allergy becomes kind of fuzzy. And I remember the very first study on this in rats, where these were rats who somehow were genetically susceptible to type 1 diabetes. And they had one group consuming some dairy products and the other group consuming none. And those consuming none did not develop type 1 diabetes, while those consuming dairy, the vast majority did. That is cross-reactivity. Yeah,
cross-reactivity with the casein molecule. And there's cross-reactivity also with gluten. There's an amino acid peptide. I think it's at least six or seven amino acids in length, so it's tiny, that is identical to that same sequence in casein. So sometimes you can have a reaction to gluten, not have much dairy at all, but still come up on the food sensitivity tests, if that's done, to casein. Yeah, cross-reactivity, definitely a factor.
Now, do food proteins cross into breast milk? The UK medical wisdom says that only dairy crosses into breast milk, but this doesn't seem to fit the clinical experience. Many babies do seem to react depending on what the breastfeeding mother has eaten.
It seems to me that may be a little bit out of date, because there's actually many studies that have addressed the effect of breastfeeding on pre and pro and symbiotics and vitamins and minerals, fiber and so on, a cow's milk, fatty acids, on the development of allergies. So it's essentially the diet of pregnant and breastfeeding women has been studied, and it does influence intrauterine development and breast milk composition. And studies can be conducted looking at the diet of pregnant and breastfeeding women to see the allergenicity or the sensitivity of their babies and infants, to see if they can be modulated by avoiding those foods or improving the gut bacteria of the mother, possibly the baby as well, in order to reduce those signs and symptoms. So it seems as, forgive me, that view of the medical world is they haven't kept up to date with the recent studies, and there are many of them. And a significant proportion of parents who believe their babies, infants are reacting to breastfeeding exposures, given that that's the only food source that the infant has, have been verified in tests. Infants with parent-reported reactivity to egg, for example, via breast milk exposure, were more likely to report multiple food allergies. So once they have a reaction to egg, there could be cross-reactivity with the various different amino acid sequences and peptides to other foods. But what's interesting is that particularly with egg, there seems to be multiple food allergies associated with egg compared to even to dairy. So it's just interesting. There are different sort of foods that may elicit a wider array of cross-reactivity. But there's no doubt whatsoever that peptides, proteins, do get through breast milk and can massively influence what the baby is exposed to, and then contribute to food reactivity. And one sort of example of the downstream sort of study looking at this is that probiotic strain I mentioned, Lactobacillus GG, it's had hundreds and hundreds of studies, and one of the studies that I read was giving it to babies and to mums, found that reduced the translocation of antigenic proteins from entering breast milk, and thereby reducing the sensitivity in the baby. So and that study was conducted at least 10 years ago.
So, there are quite a few women who breastfeed and then the baby regurgitates. Sometimes they say colic, sometimes it's very clearly vomiting. So should the first thing be to investigate what did that woman eat in the last 24 hours or so?
That would be my first thought. I'm just imagining myself in a workshop with nutritionists right now, and we'd all raise our hands and say the same thing. It's what do the mum eat? Because we'd be saying that because maybe the first thought that the medical doctor or pediatrician would have would not necessarily be that thought. Absolutely, what's going on? What was consumed, for sure, no doubt about it. And that's where diaries, food diaries, very useful. I find especially for mums who are breastfeeding, it's far too hectic a time to make a note. So actually, I would suggest taking photographs with your phone of the food you're taking, so you can actually have a look back on it, and that's actually one of the, and then or send it to the nutritionist so that the nutritionist can look at the foods. You don't actually have to write it down. So it's just a quicker method of capturing that record rather than actually writing the foods out when it's not going to be possible when you're looking after the babe. But undoubtedly, the food that's being eaten, and then I'd be wondering. Certainly, sometimes there can be symptoms within the mum, but they're ignored because we've got more important things to be doing, looking after baby. There may be no symptoms in the mum, but there could be symptoms in the babe when there aren't in the mum. So again, you can't tell from the fact that, oh, I'm okay to eat that food. That means my gorgeous little baby will be okay too. It's not the case.
So what can a breastfeeding woman, or even before that, a pregnant woman, do to help prevent allergies developing in their child?
Yeah, it's the same with as if they weren't having a baby as well. But it's whole fresh food. Have a varied diet. Again, we're looking at the numbers of foods that people consume. I think the average number of foods that the person in the UK eats 17. I think we choose most of our calories from 17 foods, which is hugely limited. And of those 17, I think the average person consumes about 50% of their calories from 3 foods. So it's a varied diet is vital, and I would maintain a rotation diet, i.e. different foods on different days, is one of the most effective methods of helping to reduce and deal with food sensitivities. But
what are those 3 foods?
Well, be wheat, dairy, and it could be eggs, or it could be soy. In America, it would be corn, because they eat a lot more corn there. But it would be wheat and or gluten grains, dairy, possibly eggs, and it depends if the individual is eating soy a lot, or oats can be a challenge too, even if they're gluten free. There's a cross reactivity with a protein in oats, which is now more problematic than ever in my experience.
So other than the varied diet, is organic particularly important, do you think? What are the other factors that could set up for a problem?
Absolutely. First of all, if food is not digested properly, then you're going to have partially digested proteins getting through the gut lumen and causing a problem. So proper digestion is absolutely vital. So that's where digestive enzymes, for example, or certainly relaxing before you eat, ensuring that the digestive system can be switched on, and chewing your food well, and not eating in a rush. And of course, this setting is probably very, very unsympathetic to mums who are in a rush. And what they've got to do is concentrate on their baby, but relaxing before you eat, chewing your food well, ensuring optimal digestion. So that's a lifestyle factor rather than a food one. Optimizing vitamins A and D, again, repetition. Optimizing zinc status, zinc particularly important. These nutrients are vital for overall well-being and fertility and optimal growth of the baby, but they're vital for mucosal immunity too. Organic food, I believe, and I've seen articles from other nutritionists in the past saying that it's a fad that we should eat organic food, and I would say it's absolutely vital. In the last 5 years, I have conducted more tests for environmental toxins in clients than I ever have in the previous 25 years. And I found that the vast majority have levels that are above the average population, the quintiles that are given. And it's clear evidence that we're consuming too much of these things. These are forever molecules. No amount is healthy. And you want to absolutely minimize these toxins and chemicals. So you, again, rather like with the canute and the wheat, modern gluten, aging gluten that you've been talking about, if you've got pesticides and herbicides on food, your immune system recognizes it not as the food, but as a food with a toxin. And so it's going to react to that food. You think, oh, I've got the reaction to this food, whereas the organic doesn't have that toxin to which you're going to have a reaction. So I would say it's absolutely sensible and vital to avoid pesticides and herbicides and have organic food where possible, for sure. You may be aware of the dirty dozen and the clean 15, and that refers to the foods that are most likely to be most sprayed and the foods that are less likely to be sprayed. So dirty dozen, clean 15 from the Environmental Working Group is useful for those people who can't access or can't afford, because it may be more expensive, organic food. I would also recommend absolutely non-processed whole food and minimize additives and food chemicals and colors. I think you were involved in teaching me about the Ben Feingold diet for hyperactivity. Absolutely plays a role. So it's not just pesticides and herbicides to inhibit bugs, but it's also what is gone in the food. So if we eat whole, fresh food, we're not going to be exposing our gut immunity to additives and colors and food chemicals and so on. So it's really eating whole and fresh, unadulterated food in variety.
And how important is breastfeeding?
I can't overstate just how important it is. I mean, there's nothing like it. I mean, when it comes to promoting optimal health and growth for infant, nothing compares to it. I mean, in fact, I've heard this, that you can actually call the only superfood for babies is breast milk, which is a quote I sort of remember from recent times. So it's also hugely important for mum too, to actually to breastfeed. So there are a number of different components in breast milk. Colostrum may be one of the most famous, particularly to do with the immune system. It's a breast fluid produced before breast milk is released. So it's the very first part of like the breastfeeding process. It's super nutritious and contains high levels of antibodies, which are the proteins that fight infections and bacteria and foods and so on. And it provides vital immunity for the baby. And again, it really helps promote optimal growth and health, is colostrum. There are also protective carbohydrate sugars, it's called oligosaccharides, that protect the baby and help the baby's development. So that's another factor. There are certain stem cells in breast milk that help to develop into many different types of tissues within the baby, such as brain, lung, and liver. And if an infant is consuming the colostrum, it consumes millions of these cells each day.
And can you give colostrum to a 1-year-old baby who's got compromised immunity?
Yes, you can. It's usually sourced from bovine source, and yes, you can. You absolutely can. So it can form probably it's the next and probably only next best available substitute if you haven't. So this is where the supplement industry, especially if the herds and the substance, i.e. the dairy product from which the colostrum is made, was organically or at least pasture fed, minimal intervention, doesn't have to be entirely organic, because then the health of the herds could be less well than if the animals were treated with certain things. But certainly where the process of the production of colostrum was intentional from the outset, as opposed to a byproduct of the dairy industry. So, but yes, absolutely, colostrum would be, I would say, one of my supplements of choice.
Now, those who become sensitive often develop multiple allergies. Why?
Yeah. Yes, and it was interesting because I quoted this research about the children with egg allergy tend to develop multiple allergies, and I think on the one hand, this cross reactivity plays a role, and it's this sequence of amino acids. And so apparently it's about 6 amino acids in particular. It's it's a tiny amount. I mean, it's tiny compared to peptides of 50 and hundreds of amino acids in length. So cross-reactivity is one. Secondly, if there's inflammation involved in a regular ongoing food allergy and sensitivity, that can lead to the terrain, the environment being one of inflammation. So it's almost like in the heat of battle, the innocent civilian gets spotted as a foe and might get shot, if you like, by the immune system, as it were. So it's the inflammation generated by the allergy could then engender an environment within the terrain that then leads to other reactivities of other co-bystanders, as it were, that were being consumed at the same time. There are certain other instances where this can happen if you have one allergy, and certainly if you have alcohol, so this would be in adults, alcohol would increase the risk of developing multiple allergies. So that might be a factor. And perhaps lastly, excessive exercise. If an individual has an allergy and they excessively exercise, that suppresses secretory IgA and increases the likelihood of reacting to any food they eat, particularly the food is consumed after training. So those could be factors. But I think cross-reactivity and overall inflammation probably explain why one allergy can then lead to others.
Yeah, I like to think of it like if you've got a worn-out, belligerent police force,
yes.
they start mistakenly arresting innocent people.
Yes, the batons come out for the wrong guys, yes.
Now, there are 14 allergens that can cause anaphylaxis.
Oh, yes.
What do they have in common? E.g., why nuts or shellfish can, but cucumber and tomatoes can't?
Yeah, I've heard of these 14. I think I know most of them. There are, obviously, you've got milk. Yes, I've actually looked at those fairly recently. So, what do I have? Yes, good question. I think sulfur dioxide, which is an E number, I think it's E220, and that is one. It's good. It's a good question. I'm not sure I can give you an answer what they have in common. They actually, I'm not sure I can tell you the answer. I kind of know what they are. I mean, gluten, milk, and wheat and eggs, I think, are on the list too, and certain nuts and peanuts. Oh, I think celery is too, which is why it comes up on the list on the food. If you turn the food over and celery is on there, it highlights it in bold on the back of the food product. It's not the same amino acid sequence, So actually, I recognize that these foods do cook, but in terms of the actual biochemical molecular assessment, I'm not sure I can give the answer.
Well, if you find out, let me know, and I'll put it in our Facebook group, when the podcast is out.
Yes.
Now, the sale of EpiPens, where you inject adrenaline, always gets me thinking of Pulp Fiction. If one has an anaphylactic shock, has gone through the roof. And by the way, these EpiPens, they look a little bit like a sort of cigarette packet, and you take the lid off, and it tells you what to do, and you put it against the skin and you press. So, it's not quite like Pulp Fiction anymore.
Yes.
But the sale of EpiPens has gone through the roof. Why does adrenaline work? To calm down a massive reaction, what's going on? And actually, the latest advice is to have 2 EpiPens. So if the first one doesn't work, you whack in the second.
Yeah, and there's a really sad story of Natasha, who was a 15-year-old, I remember, and she was on a flight from Heathrow to France, I think, and she ate a baguette from I think it was Pret a Manger, and it didn't say it's got sesame on it. And she, but then the father gave her 2 EpiPen injections, which is not necessarily reassuring for the audience. And she may have needed 3 or 4, it's true, but unfortunately she died from the sesame, which is extremely rare, which is why it hit the headlines. But adrenaline, what it does, it opens up the airways, so that actually stops the respiratory failure, so that's hugely important. It reduces swelling and raises blood pressure, because you get a real hypertensive response with anaphylaxis. So really, I think the 3 major pathways through which adrenaline works is just that: opens the airways, reduces swelling, and suppresses the immune system activity and raises blood pressure, because it's a super sensitive immune reactivity.
And why is the blood pressure helping?
Well, effectively with anaphylaxis, it can be a syncope, can be a hypo blood pressure effect, which can therefore drain blood away and have a significant impact on the central nervous system. So you want to raise blood pressure in those instances. It doesn't always work for everyone, but certainly it's you put it in the middle part of the thigh. The directions are given, not in the heart, like in Pulp Fiction. But it certainly can be effective, and I'm aware that it is selling out. And my sister-in-law's a nurse, and she's always encouraging everyone who has allergies to have at least 2 EpiPens. Yes.
Is it only proteins that cause allergic type reactions?
Yeah, that's a good one. Given that antibodies recognize protein sequences, so yes, the vast majority of things to which we have allergies are proteins. Yes, there are a few exceptions, but effectively, yes, they're mostly protein. There's a couple of things that you may have heard of. CRP, of course you have, and the name arose because it was first identified as a substance in the serum of patients with acute inflammation that reacted to the carbohydrate antibody of the capsule of pneumococcus, apparently. So it is a carbohydrate. There's also another sort of interesting sort of quirk of terms of CA19. Is a commonly used tumor marker for some types of cancer. The CA something, but they've got various different numbers on them. And that's the term for the carbohydrate antigen. Interestingly, the carbohydrate antigen is still a protein. So apart from just a couple of exceptions involving immunity, the vast majority of allergies are indeed to proteins. Not all of them, but the vast majority, yes.
And proteins are made of strings of amino acids, and when they're shorter strings, they're called peptides. So amino acids are like letters, peptides are like words, and proteins are like sentences.
Yes.
Does cooking break down proteins and reduce allergic sensitivity?
No, the protein doesn't get. No, effectively, it doesn't really. So the cooking can seal the protein. Yes. But not by any great amount, no. I think with the cooking proteins, effectively, I think what's more of concern is the sort of generation of these heterocyclic amines and these what's called polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons from meats, which is basically chemicals formed when you heat the muscle of beef, for example, or chicken at high temperatures, particularly when you're grilling them over an open flame, and they can contribute to types of cancer, colon cancer, breast cancer, and so on. So I think there's more of a concern with that than to do with allergy risk. So I'm not aware of cooking have any significant impact on moderating the allergic response to any protein.
The convention is that IgE type antibodies cause allergies, although we know that IgG antibodies can also produce allergies, but we call them food intolerances, I think partly for political reasons, actually.
Yes, yeah.
But there are many conditions from irritable bowel syndrome to a rather recent one called FPIES, or food protein induced enterocolitis syndrome, that are not necessarily mediated by IgE. What is an antibody? What are we learning about their role in sensitivity? You've already mentioned IgA.
Yeah, it's actually secretory IgA in particular rather than IgA, because there's no correlation, interestingly, between the blood levels of IgA and secretory IgA. They're not to be mistaken. Yeah, originally, when I wrote that book, the Food Intolerance Bible, of course, I should have been calling it the Food Sensitivity Bible. So allergy and sensitivity are immune mediated, and intolerance is a reflection of maldigestion of a carbohydrate within a food, such as lactose intolerance. So I got the wording wrong at the time. So in fact, what's interesting, the word allergy originally in about 1900 was basically meant, the definition of it was an adverse reaction to anything. Then immunologists came along and they decided to say, well, okay, we're going to compartmentalize things and we're going to make IgE ours. And if it's, and that's called a true food allergy. And if it's anything else, it's a not true, it's a non-true food, non-true allergy. So it's like, no, that doesn't exist. So the language has been rather dismissive. But certainly of late, IgG is absolutely correlated with food sensitivity, and the binding of IgG antibodies with a protein in the food, for example, it could be bacteria as well, results in an antigen coating and the formation of what's called an immune complex. Now, an immune complex effectively gets into the bloodstream and then can lead and can trigger further immune responses, releasing these what's called pro-inflammatory cytokines, which then develops inflammation elsewhere in the body. So what's interesting in celiacs, which is the sort of allergy to gluten condition, there are more symptoms outside of the gut than within the gut. So you can't confine food sensitivity or food reactions just solely within the gut. Now, to answer your question about what an antibody is, an antibody it's an immunoglobulin. It's a large Y-shaped protein, so Y-shaped protein used by the immune system to help to identify and then neutralize foreign objects, such as a food protein or pathogenic bacteria or virus. And the antibody recognizes the unique molecule of the food. So it's like having, if you use the army terms again, it's like having a bullet with your name on it. So if you're only going to shoot that which is got, so it's just like a specific assassin's bullet, which is only going to address a specific protein, as opposed to all the bad guys or all the foods in the environment, in the milieu. So there's no doubt that IgG reactivities will also be higher when there is a compromised level of secretory IgA.
So if you had an allergic child, would you always test for both IgE and IgG reactions?
And I would even consider IgA as well. Yes, yes, I would, definitely. In fact, there are only a few labs that do offer the IgA, but what's interesting is that can be quite useful. But definitely, IgE is a general marker, and that's looking at allergy. But food sensitivity, which is the delayed response, it's not the acute response, IgE can be very, very useful. And I've gone through waves of using lab tests, thinking that I might be able to identify the usual suspects. And I'm currently in a wave, which might be for a year or two long now, in my 30 years of practice, of actually using food sensitivity testing more. And one of the reasons is there's always a food on there that I never would have clinically guessed at. That needs to be avoided. And whilst the major culprits may be the most important to avoid, there's always been a food or two or three that I would never have guessed at. So the food sensitivity testing with IgG, I do find it useful. It is relevant, and the studies that have been conducted showing, which are double-blind studies where individuals have avoided certain foods which are correctly IgG positive, and then they avoided foods which are not IgG positive. The group that avoided the foods that really were causing a reaction had an improvement in their signs and symptoms, whereas the group of people who avoided the foods which were not positive in the test didn't have any change in their symptoms. So quite nice studies, absolutely showing the benefit of individuals avoiding those IgG positive foods.
So to recap, we've got secretory IgA in the gut, which is terribly important to have lots of.
Yes.
Its levels doesn't correlate to IgA in the blood or IgE or IgG. So if money was no object, test them all, because they're all showing if your immune system is reacting.
Yes, some people are going to have a high level of secretory IgA, and that might be a warning sign that they've got overreactivity, even if they don't have symptoms. It could also be an indicator that within the gut, the immune system is fighting an unwelcome bug, such as a bacteria or yeast too.
And according to the official original definition, I can be allergic to the washing up.
Yes.
Now,
and that might be a chemical sensitivity, which is actually, again, the chemicals should not be overlooked. I know I've covered that briefly, but
no, I don't think it's not a chemical sensitivity. Let's talk about histamine and so-called histamine intolerance. How do you know if a person is having a histamine reaction?
It's opened the lids, not on was it Pandora's box? Quite. There are so many different signs and symptoms of histamine reactivity, and it's a subject that I have studied and come across, and it's actually it's more common today with the appreciation of mast cell activation syndrome, which is another histamine mediated issue. So histamine intolerance, there's a massive overlap with this thing called mast cell activation syndrome. You can have gut symptoms, so that's colic, bloating, diarrhea, constipation, nausea, feeling inappropriately full after a meal, or menstrual cramps even. So that's sort of gut related. You can have skin conditions. So you get red skin, and that's the classic one that we know about. Red skin, swollen eyelids, perhaps, itchy skin, eczema gets worse. You can have cardiovascular symptoms such as headache, dizziness, this hypotonia, palpitations, even fainting can occur. And then there's respiratory issues, to which we might have greatest concern, but it could be linked to sneezing, asthma, difficulty breathing, or nose congestion, for example. So all of those need to be assessed. In fact, there is a questionnaire produced by researchers in the subject in 2021, which I use with my clients, just to help to screen that out. If I get a sense that's involved, I actually send clients that questionnaire as well. So we've actually got a chart to see how they get on, and they can complete that every single week just by ticking the boxes.
Can we post that in my Facebook group?
I will send you that. Yes, it comes from Schneidel and Enco. They published that in 2021. It's not my paper. I'll send you the questionnaire and the reference, and certainly you can use that for sure.
Fantastic. Now, which foods contain histamine?
Yeah, there are lots of foods that contain histamine. The high histamine foods. So alcoholic beverages, so beer and wine and liquor. And I've often wondered why beer and wine cause more issues than perhaps other liquors. But for alcohol, fermented foods. So there's sort of this real clamoring for sort of eating fermented food and so on being good for our gut, but it could be really the wrong thing to do for an individual who's got compromised issues with histamine. So sauerkraut, pickles, yogurt, kimchi, all those things high in histamine. Shellfish, dairy foods, aged foods, certain cheeses. Most cheeses are high in histamine, certainly the hard cheeses and soft cheeses too. Wheat, wouldn't you know it? Nuts, not just peanuts, but cashews as well. There are certain fruits, citrus fruits containing banana, papaya, strawberries. And there's other categories as well, which we might go into. There's certain vegetables, tomatoes, spinach, aubergine, avocado, for example. Food additives, coloring and preservatives. And most of all, basically, the key is to eat fresh whole food and not stored food. So it's canned fish. Any food that don't ever, if you've got histamine intolerance, put the meal that you've just eaten, put the remainder in the fridge and then eat it for dinner later. That because the histamine is generated in higher amounts in exactly that kind of stored food. In fact, if you are going to store food, the best thing to do is to freeze it instantly, and then don't let it thaw out too much, but then cook it or have it as soon as it's thawed out, etc. So it's the storing of food. Absolutely fascinating. There are also foods that trigger a histamine response that don't contain histamine necessarily, but are called histamine liberators. And the real challenge here is that chocolate and cocoa, cocoa is a super antioxidant provider and polyphenol provider, also is a histamine liberator. So it liberates histamine. So you've got not necessarily a high level of histamine in the food, but it liberates certain foods. And then you have other foods which contain biogenic amines, and histamine is a biogenic amine, and they contain biogenic amines, and it competes for the diamine oxidase activity. And what's interesting, the diamine oxidase, the DAO enzyme, preferentially heads towards those before it heads to the foods rich in histamine. So it deals with these foods over here, and these foods are pineapple, banana is on the list, peanuts are there actually, raspberries, legumes, kiwi, oranges, papaya, and wheat germ apparently on that list of biogenic amines. So the DAO gets consumed by those, and there's not enough left for the histamine in the histamine-rich foods. And then, furthermore, I know it's an interesting subject, and it's a massive subject, and it hugely influences people's health. They've got it. There are foods that inhibit the DAO enzyme, which operates within the gut only.
So back in the 70s, Carl Pfeiffer introduced me to histamine. He had found that 10% of schizophrenics had high histamine levels.
Yes.
And also in a very basic blood test, high basophils, he said was an indicator of that possibility. He recommended at that time, histidine is an amino acid that's much sort of richer in kind of meat proteins. And his general advice was to be a little bit more sort of vegetarian inclined. In other words, don't go on a very high protein diet. That was his sort of kind of antihistamine obviously have lots of vitamin C, which are very potent antihistamine. And then in well, I'd say more recent years, for the last 20 years, we've understood that the process of methylation, so dependent on B vitamins, B6, B12, folate particularly, but also zinc and trimethylglycine, actually breaks down histamine. So is that part of this?
Yeah, you've got two enzymes that break down histamine. One is in the gut, the DAO, diamine oxidase, and then you've got the HNMT, which is histamine N-methyltransferase. And also the word methyl suggests that the methylation support will be used, and that works systemically. So it really is a question of identifying whether the individual has the issue in the gut. And for that, there are a limited number. And also I've had to say great disappointment in clients who've taken the DAO enzyme, which they may have bought from Holland because we can't get it in this country so easily, and had no benefit whatsoever. And yet it's apparent that they've, on a test they've had for DAO, it's low, but the DAO supplement hasn't made a difference. So I think there's having a low histamine diet sensible, and certainly for those individuals who appear to be having a systemic effect, supporting this HNMT, this histamine N-methyltransferase enzyme with the cofactors for methylation, folate, B12, B6.
And can you, so you can measure DAO, you can measure the methyltransferase, you can measure, you can't.
I'm not aware of it. I'm not aware of a lab test for HNMT, but I am aware of lab tests for DAO.
So I guess homocysteine would be the indicator of that, really.
Yeah, I think it's probably the best marker.
And you can measure histamine. So I know kids who react to avocado, banana, aubergine, raspberry, such seemingly innocent foods. Do you think this is due to histamine?
I've just listed those foods. I've just called them out, as it were.
Except for avocado and aubergine.
No, actually, aubergine was on the list of histamine foods. And aubergine and avocado. Yeah, so it could be a histamine response. So then it's a question of looking at what's the overall terrain in those individuals. Are they consuming other high histamine foods that then may lead them to somewhat quirkily have reaction to, especially avocado being such a nourishing food. I appreciate the eggplant's part of or aubergine's part of the nightshade family, but it's
I love it. Now, why not just give an antihistamine like Benadryl? Is it harmful?
Well, I certainly think for those with MCAS, mast cell activation syndrome, they are recommended H1 and H2 blockers. Look, there are 4 different receptors for histamine, and hence the different drugs are H1 or H2 blockers. I'm not aware of ones which are H3 and H4 blockers. So I think if the reaction is severe, I think, and you simply want to have an immediate benefit, I think taking something like an antihistamine may be over the counter, may be useful. It depends on potential side effects. Certainly some individuals can be quite drowsy. Even if they say they're non-drowsy, the individuals can be fatigued and it can affect cognitive function as a result. But I think that's certainly one option. If we just look at it from that linear perspective, can I take an antihistamine to help those symptoms in my child or myself? And I want to have that on the shelf. That might be a good idea. However, from a holistic perspective, I would say, well, first of all, we could use an alternative that might be equally as effective. There are natural antihistamines. There's a flavonoid luteolin, which is a very, very good antihistamine. Quercetin is quite well known. Nettle leaf extract, there's rutin. There's a specific strain of lactobacillus, Patrick, called L92, and it's been trialed in Japan and helps reduce birch allergy. So it's lactobacillus L92. There's a Perilla frutescens seed extract. We know about vitamin C. There's something called phycetin. So, and there are various different mixtures within various different supplements that are specifically looking to lower histamine. But that's kind of a pill for an ill. Again, we look for the terrain. So if you or your child has a reaction, then take a step back, have a 35,000 foot view and say, well, what's going with the microbiome? What's going with the gut lining? How many of the usual suspect foods are they eating? Are they getting a good night's sleep? Do they have too much stress? Maybe have they got adequate vitamin A? Because apparently the diet doesn't have much now because we've greatly reduced our fat soluble containing foods. So I think there's a short-term sort of knee-jerk reaction which you can have. And then there's a longer term project about supporting overall health.
Now, do certain vaccinations trigger autoimmunity? And if so, which ones and why? And is there anything we've learned from the last 2 years of coronavirus vaccines? Yeah,
that's a good question. The first of all, I'm not sure I can say which ones, etc. But I believe there are adjuvants in the vast majority of vaccines before this current strain of messenger RNA so-called vaccines, the really experimental gene jabs, came on the market. So the adjuvants, the toxins, but first it was mercury, they replaced lots of the mercury with aluminium. And when you've got these toxins, they're latching onto cells. And I'll go back to something I said earlier, is that when the immune system recognizes the cell, attacks this cell, it's attacking it, or the nucleus, for example, with ANA levels being high as a marker of autoimmunity. It's actually attacking the cell with aluminium. It's attacking the cell with something else. So these adjuvants are foreign molecules, and the immune system recognizes them as such. And when they attach or in certain cell membranes, that's when the body will have a reaction to them. So the introduction via a route, which are non-oral route, straight into the bloodstream or intramuscularly, it negates the usual protective pathways of stopping these molecules getting inside the body. And so these molecules they actually concentrate in various different tissues. And so that sets the scene for the immune system to say, hey, I don't recognize you. I'm going to make an antibody against you. So absolutely, would one be cautious of having any jab if one had a disposition to or an existing autoimmune condition? And you may be aware that the average person with one autoimmune condition on average has at least one, i.e. they have more than one, they have two or three. And so in the first weeks of these mRNA experimental genes medicines being on the market, I was watching the immune news, and it was basically the group of people that should not take these at that time were those with autoimmunity. And the same still holds true. And yet that message has, of course, been not really spread too far by the mainstream. So I would say every jab has an increased risk of autoimmunity. It depends on the nature of the specific types of adjuvants and toxins within it, and where those tissues, where they end up in the tissues, as to what that might drive. But then there's a genetic component too, because certain people may be more genetically disposed to rheumatoid arthritis, some may be more disposed to MS, for example, and any of these toxins may actually drive either one of them. But I'm afraid that's too complicated a question for me to go beyond that which I've answered just now.
Yeah, and in principle, I mean, many of my doctor friends, actually didn't get vaccinated, but the ones that did, sometimes because they had to, working in nursing homes, etc., prepped. They really got their vitamin C up, their vitamin D. Some took aspirin, because there's always a clotting effect as well.
Yes.
And it was always logical to me. I mean, anyone who's actually been in clinical practice knows that the reality is there's a very small percentage of kids who became autistic after the MMR. I mean, it's just like, it's happened. I've met, well over 100 who said, where parents said, my child stopped talking, within 3 days. So it suggests an autoimmune issue. It's not an accumulation of aluminium. Something is triggering it straight away. So I always thought that before a vaccine, it might be very sensible to go on a hypoallergenic diet. So you don't have that, you're basically trying to lower the overall load.
Yes. Completely right. Completely. If that was no option, and then it was an unfortunate certainty that the jab had to be taken, then categorically you want to totally prepare that individual. Big prep time, definitely.
Yeah. Now, of course, the dialectic view is to avoid the offending item, but you approach things differently, as we've heard, different ways to build up your immune resistance. Should we be clean or dirty?
Yeah, good question. I think certainly I would look to, if I could identify whether it's for the test or whether it's through clinical observations where it's just common sense. So look, little Johnny is consuming, gluten in 4 different forms on 3 different occasions every single day, then avoidance of that is going to be a sensible idea. Sometimes, however, for compliance, if the family or the individual is not willing to engage in it, when you have the test done and they've got the piece of paper coming back and it shows it on the test result in red and it's clearly a negative impact, sometimes that is actually so useful as well for the compliance, even if they understand intellectually, just to really help them to avoid that food. But along with the avoidance of the obvious usual suspects, I would absolutely look to engage and support the mucosal immunity as we've been describing today, and the gut lining barrier, without a doubt. And my analogy for excluding these foods is a bit like painting with a water-based paint, trying to paint a wall in the pouring rain. I mean, there's literally just no point. So really we want to paint the wall when it's not raining, and if you follow the analogy. So let's take away the source of something which would have a negative impact on our health, and then we can actually do the healing, and that'll work all the better. And I think playing with dirt has been absolutely shown. This is linked to the hygiene hypothesis. Yeah, clean, basically wiping everything clean. It's actually kind of like a biological insanity, as so many things are that we hear, unfortunately, in modern times. It's just insane. You actually, without a shadow of a doubt, allergies, if you're a single child and don't have brothers and sisters, you are considerably percentage-wise more likely to have an allergy or sensitivity than if you have one or two or three kin. So if you're one of, got brothers and sisters, the reason being is because you're playing with your brothers and sisters more likely outside than just by yourself, but also you're exposed to their bugs and dirt as well. So it's absolutely right. Go and play in the field and get your fingers and engage with the earth microbiome as well. So dirty is my response to that one.
Now, sadly, we've run out of time. I want to hit you with two final questions as a wrap up. And the first is, so for parents listening who have extremely allergic children, what overall is your advice?
I think, like I said, identify and avoid the major culprits, which would be the heavy rain in that analogy with painting the wall. So avoid the major culprits categorically, because that can take the burden off. It's so difficult to get a positive outcome, positive response if they're still being consumed. And that might well need some advice, but also the usual suspects, we've talked about them. It's quite obvious to identify what they are. I think certainly maintaining, if we talk about hygiene, maintaining a dust-free home. Yes, dust can definitely contribute all kinds of toxins. So actually, we haven't mentioned that today, but certainly having a dust-free and being clean, yes, but not hyper clean. It's not being super hygienic. So I was saying, so dust-free home, yes, but I wouldn't use antibacterials all over the house. So there's a difference I wanted to sort of pass apart there. Encourage play in the dirt rather than looking at screens. Support the child with a variety of food. So it's not eating the same food every day. Rotation of a variety of food, having avoid the major culprits. Ensure optimal levels, if you're able to, vitamins A, D, and zinc. We repeated those. And also consider those probiotics, the Lactobacillus GG and Saccharomyces boulardii to help secretory IgA. And I think really the key is to observe exactly what the child's life and diet is like, and then aim to optimize it with regard to mucosal immunity. So you take things away. And it may be of value to consider some of the natural antihistamines so that there's less need for medication as well.
And finally, for all of us, what's the key nutritional and lifestyle guidelines to keep our immune systems working for you, not against you?
Yeah, I think repetition is always good when listening to these things. So I think I may have said these things already, but I think relaxing before you eat, because that allows the digestion to work. If you can't digest food, you're going to have a reaction to it, essentially. So you need to relax before you eat and chew your food well. I think that was lesson number one in 1990 for me at the Institute for Optimal Nutrition. Do not eat large meals. So that's another one. You're not going to be able to digest them. Eat a variety of foods, whole foods, eat organic. Consider digestive enzymes, certainly, because if you break the food down, you've got much less chance of having immune reactivity to it. If you do have a disposition to reactivity, I certainly would consider that the use of S. boulardii and lacto-GG. Consider other specific gut lining support, which might include glutamine, N-acetylglucosamine. You can get a vegan form of that, not just from shellfish. And there are other different nutrients, rutin, quercetin can help that too, the gut lining. I think for most folk, we've got stresses, and stress absolutely has a major impact on mucosal immunity. So so it's a non-nutritional, but it's a lifestyle one. Identify, maybe with a partner or with a good friend or a practitioner, identify the stresses and see how you can have a different response to those stresses. It's much easier said than done, and does require a lot of work and inner work too, and change of outlook sometimes. But that it could be the character of the person that disposes them to then express their genetic disposition of allergy, for example, i.e. worry, anxiety. And we know that's increased over the last couple of years, perhaps for good reason. Get a good night's sleep every night. So vital. So huge important for the restoration, recovery, and repair processes to get a good night's sleep. Absolutely vital. Now, I haven't got a study on my fingertips, but I'm sure it would take me 5 minutes on PubMed to find studies that show that people who have insomnia, disrupted sleep, are more likely to have allergies. Do not over-exercise, but of course, and that's a proportion of the population. And I was in that group when I was younger. But take exercise in one form or another regularly. So regular exercise supports the immune system, but over-exercise does the opposite. It suppresses it. In fact, one study of triathletes were tested with their spit test just before the event. So they're very fit, but they hadn't done exercise that day. And they had normal levels of secretory IgA across the board. And every single one then did a spit test afterwards. So this must have been a little project for some group of folk. they took their saliva after the event, immediately after the event, and every single triathlete had a low level of secretory IgA. So just to give you an example of more extreme exercise, it lowers secretory IgA. And I would certainly consider minimizing the usual suspects and having, for sure, and avoiding ultra processed foods. And I would say, lastly, bearing in mind the subject we haven't really talked about too much, at least not directly, is the issue of toxins on the planet. I would say that this detox is a daily phenomenon, a daily need, not a 2-week holiday once a year. So I think engaging in detoxification support, whether it's skin brushing, saunas, Epsom salt baths, ensuring optimal bowel function, hugely important to diminish the burden of toxins within the system. Because when the toxic bowel gets too full, the body then has reactions, and that can contribute to allergies as well. Thanks for listening.
I have an Epsom salt bath almost every day. So I remember you, Antony, 20 years ago, studying at ION, getting very good grades. And I have to say, I'm extremely proud of all that you've done and all that you've shared, and literally the thousands of people that you've helped. Thank you for sharing your excellent and eloquent and highly practical wisdom. How do people reach you if they want a consultation?
Yeah, thank you so much, Patrick. And of course, it's right back at you, because it wasn't for you and Chris founding the ION. Who knows? I might have gone somewhere else. It's true, but it definitely changed the course of my life. I did leave the armed forces to be a nutritionist, and then I found the ION. So I'm extremely grateful. Right back at you for that. And it's been easy on one level, because I'm being so passionately engaged in the subject, and I love. Someone said to me, how are you going to celebrate your 30th year of practice? And I said, I don't need to celebrate, because I still have the same joy and pleasure of someone doing better with their health now as I did then. So it's a celebration in itself. But to reach me, probably the best thing is, although I do have a website, but really it's sort of not quite finished, because I actually have never really needed one, because I've been so blessed with having so many referrals from existing clients, essentially. My email, it's my name, it's Antony J. Haynes, Antony without an H. So it's Antony J. Haynes at AOL.com. I mean, email probably the best route. And if you don't get a reply from me in 3 or 4 days, please just resend it, because of the sheer number I might get on certain days. So Antony J. Haynes at AOL.com.
And it's Haynes, not
correct.
Like Haynes, mayonnaise.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Antony. No I anywhere. Antony J. Haynes, Haynes at AOL.com. Yes, that's the best route. Love to hear from anybody. As I said, if you haven't heard from me in 3 or 4 days, just send it again. Please don't think you're irritating me. It's just bringing yourself back to the top of the list.
Antony, thank you very much for being my podcast guest.
And thank you for having me.